David Miller stood on the weathered porch of his ancestral home, the evening sun casting long shadows across the expansive lawn. His gaze drifted past the ancient oak in the front yard, over the gently rolling hills of what was once farmland, now rapidly being swallowed by the burgeoning suburban sprawl of Willow Creek Estates. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth a stark contrast to the freshly laid asphalt just beyond his property line. This land, 5 sprawling acres of untamed woodland and open meadow, was more than just a house, it was a sanctuary, a legacy. It had been in the Miller family for 4 generations, a beacon of constancy in a world that spun increasingly fast. It was here, among these venerable trees and winding paths, that David had rebuilt his life after Sarah, his wife, passed away 5 years ago. This was where Emily, his 11-year-old, and Sarah, his 7-year-old namesake, had found solace and a sense of belonging amidst their grief. Their home, a charming but slightly ramshackle farmhouse, stood as a quiet protest against the cookie-cutter perfection of the new houses popping up around them like mushrooms after a rain. The very first time the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, came calling, David had met them with a polite but firm refusal. Priscilla Vance, the HOA president, was a woman sculpted from granite and designer fabrics. Her blonde bob was perfectly coiffed, her smile a practiced, unblinking beam. She exuded an aura of immaculate control, like the perfectly manicured lawns that defined her domain. She'd arrived on his doorstep armed with glossy brochures detailing future development opportunities, and a generous offer for his property. Mr. Miller, Priscilla had begun, her voice a smooth, cultured purr, your land, while undeniably picturesque, represents a unique opportunity for the Willow Creek Estates community. It's a prime location for our planned multi-use recreational path, connecting the western phase directly to the new shopping district. Think of the convenience for our residents. David had listened patiently, sipping his iced tea. Ms. Vance, I appreciate the offer, and the vision for Willow Creek. But this isn't just land. It's home. It's been our family's home for over a century. My children grew up here, my wife loved this place more than anywhere on earth. It's not for sale. Priscilla's smile had remained fixed, but her eyes, the color of glacial ice, had hardened imperceptibly. I understand sentimentality, Mr. Miller. Truly. But sometimes, progress requires difficult decisions. We're offering a substantial sum. Enough to purchase a comparable property, perhaps even larger, outside the immediate development zone. Comparable doesn't exist, Ms. Vance, David had replied, his voice calm but resolute. This land is unique. It's where my daughters feel safe. Where they connect with nature. It's not just a plot of dirt, it's part of who we are. So, respectfully, my answer is no. It will never be for sale. The purr had vanished from Priscilla's voice, replaced by a clipped, steely tone. That's unfortunate, Mr. Miller. We truly believe this path is essential for the long-term prosperity and convenience of Willow Creek Estates. I hope you'll reconsider. We are a community dedicated to maximizing property values and ensuring a harmonious living environment. Her gaze had lingered for a moment on the slightly overgrown wildflowers near his fence line, a silent judgment of his property's perceived imperfection in their pristine landscape. Then, with a curt nod, she had departed, leaving David with a prickle of unease he couldn't quite shake. He knew, instinctively, that no wasn't an answer Priscilla Vance was accustomed to hearing. The initial pressure from the HOA was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not living under their microscope. First came the courtesy notices. A letter about his lawn, supposedly marginally above regulation height, despite David having mowed it just days prior. Then a notice about a garden gnome near the mailbox being an unapproved outdoor decoration. These were trivial, easily dismissed as the petty annoyances of suburban living, but they chipped away at the tranquility David sought. He paid the fines, grumbled to himself, and tried to ignore the growing sense of being watched. Then came the more pointed communications. The HOA began sending official-looking documents about easement surveys and right-of-way assessments concerning the strip of woodland running along the eastern edge of his property. This was a dense, thorny thicket that served as a natural buffer between his land and the farthest reaches of the new development. There was no existing path there, it was wild, untamed. The HOA's claim was that this strip was essential for future infrastructure development, and that David's property was obstructing a planned public easement. David scoured his property deeds. The deeds were old, dating back to the 19th century, with hand-drawn maps and archaic language. There was no mention of any public easement or right-of-way through his specific parcel. He contacted a local land surveyor, a gruff man named Stan Jenkins, who had helped David's father with boundary disputes years ago. Stan confirmed David's findings: there was no recorded public easement through the disputed part of his land. "They're just trying to strong-arm you, David," Stan had advised, shaking his head. "Priscilla Vance runs that HOA like her personal kingdom. She wants your land, plain and simple. This easement is just a pretext." But the words on paper seemed to mean little to Priscilla. One crisp autumn morning, David was inside, making breakfast for the girls, when he heard a commotion outside. It wasn't the usual sound of lawnmowers or construction from the new development. This was closer, more insistent. He heard Emily gasp, followed by a choked cry from Sarah. He dropped the spatula and rushed to the back door, his heart leaping into his throat. What he saw sent a wave of icy dread through him. Two large, burly men, wearing neon safety vests and carrying chainsaws and industrial weed whackers, were methodically tearing through the thicket on the eastern edge of his property. Behind them, supervising with a clipboard in hand, stood Priscilla Vance, her expression cool and determined. They had already cut through the old wire fence that marked his boundary, leaving a jagged, gaping hole. Emily stood frozen on the patio, her eyes wide with fear, clutching Sarah's hand. Sarah, usually a whirlwind of energy, was visibly trembling, her face pale and tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy," she wailed, pointing a shaky finger. They're breaking our trees. They're in our woods." David's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a dispute about property lines anymore. This was a deliberate, brazen invasion. And they had terrified his children. He stormed out, his voice laced with a fury he rarely displayed. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he roared, stopping just short of the trespassers. Priscilla looked up, her composure unnerving. "Ah, Mr. Miller. Just conducting the necessary survey and clearing for the Willow Creek Estates recreational path. As per the notices you've received. We simply cannot have your property obstructing a vital community thoroughfare." She gestured with her clipboard towards the mangled fence. "We did try to contact you about this scheduled work, but it seems you were unavailable." "Unavailable?" David exploded, gesturing wildly at his trembling daughters. "You broke my fence. You're on my property. You terrified my children. There's no damn path here. This is my land. Our legal team assures us we have every right to establish this easement, Mr. Miller," Priscilla stated, her voice calm, almost patronizing. "It's for the greater good of the community. We understand this may be an inconvenience, but it's necessary progress." She paused, her gaze sweeping over his property, then back to his face. "Perhaps if you had considered our previous offers for this land, none of this would be necessary. You're being rather uncooperative." "Uncooperative?" David echoed, his voice dangerously low. "You trespass on my land, you scare my kids, and you call me uncooperative? Get off my property. Now. Or I'm calling the sheriff." Priscilla sighed theatrically. "Very well. But understand, Mr. Miller, this path will be built. And any continued obstruction will result in escalating legal action and fines. We have the community's interests at heart." She gave a curt nod to the workers, who continued to clear a path, ignoring David's furious commands. David knew arguing further would be useless. He clenched his fists, feeling a helpless rage simmer beneath his skin. He turned and went back to his daughters, pulling them close, their small bodies still trembling. He had to protect them. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was about their peace, their sense of security. And David knew, with grim certainty, that he was in for the fight of his life. He'd dismiss a fine, but he would not let anyone scare his girls. He immediately called the local sheriff's department. A deputy arrived an hour later, long after Priscilla and her crew had packed up, leaving a raw, scarred wound in the wooded buffer zone. The deputy listened patiently, looked at David's deeds, and inspected the damaged fence. "It's a civil matter, Mr. Miller," he explained with a sigh. "Property line disputes are usually handled by lawyers. We can file a report, but we can't really intervene unless there's a clear criminal act or a physical altercation. You'll need to get a restraining order or a court order." David consulted a lawyer specializing in property law. The lawyer, a weary-looking man named Mark, explained that while David's deed seemed solid, HOA bylaws could be tricky. Old easements could be re-established, under certain conditions, and powerful HOAs often had deep pockets for legal battles. "They'll drag this out, David," Mark warned. "It'll be expensive, stressful, and they'll try to wear you down. Most people just give in. Especially when it impacts their daily life and family." David knew giving in wasn't an option. Not now. Not after seeing the terror in his daughter's eyes. The skirmishes escalated. The raw cut in David's fence remained a visible scar, a constant reminder of the invasion. The HOA followed up the trespass with a formal legal notice, asserting their right to establish a vital community access path and threatening a lawsuit if David continued to obstruct progress. They also began to subtly ramp up their nuisance fines: a failure to maintain adequate drainage from his historical gutters, a violation of noise ordinances for his old, charming, but creaky porch swing. More disturbingly, the HOA started a public relations campaign within Willow Creek Estates. Flyers appeared in mailboxes and on community bulletin boards, subtly portraying David as an unreasonable, selfish old-timer holding back the entire neighborhood. "Don't let one stubborn property owner stop our children from having safe access to the new shopping center," one flyer declared. "Support the Willow Creek Estates recreational path, a benefit for all." Anonymous comments appeared on the neighborhood online forum, accusing David of destroying property values and being anti-community. The community began to divide. Some neighbors, long fed up with Priscilla's authoritarian style, cautiously offered David support. Old Mr. Henderson, who lived across the street and whose garden shed had recently been deemed an unapproved auxiliary structure by the HOA, brought over a plate of cookies. "Don't let her push you around, David," he muttered, his eyes twinkling with defiance. "That woman thinks she owns the whole damn neighborhood." Sarah and Emily's friends' parents, the Chengs, stopped by to express their concern and offer help. "We saw what they did," Mrs. Cheng said, her voice low. "It was uncalled for. They're bullies." But others, swayed by the HOA's carefully crafted narrative of progress and convenience, or simply afraid of Priscilla's retribution, became cold and distant. Some waved less, some stopped making eye contact. The once friendly street felt increasingly fractured. The emotional toll on Emily and Sarah was the heaviest burden for David. The initial fear had deepened into a pervasive anxiety. Sarah, who once loved to explore the woods behind their house, now clung to David's side, refusing to venture beyond the fenced backyard. She had nightmares about bad men with big saws. Emily, more reserved, tried to hide her fear, but David often caught her staring out the window at the scarred edge of their property, a worried frown on her face. She stopped inviting friends over, afraid of the awkwardness with their parents. David's resolve hardened. He couldn't let this stand. Not only for his land, but for his daughter's sake. He felt the weight of their fear every single day. He doubled down on his legal research, poring over every line of his deeds, every dusty HOA bylaw he could find online. He learned about adverse possession, prescriptive easements, and declarations of covenants. The legal labyrinth was daunting. He went back to Mark, his lawyer, and explained the escalating intimidation and the daughter's distress. Mark's expression softened. "This changes things, David. We're not just fighting a property dispute anymore. We can build a case for intentional infliction of emotional distress, for harassment, for a violation of your property rights that goes beyond a simple civil trespass. This starts looking like a calculated campaign of intimidation." Mark connected David with a specialist in HOA law and community litigation, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Elena Ramirez. Elena listened intently to David's story, her eyes narrowed. "Priscilla Vance, huh?" she murmured, a hint of recognition in her voice. "I've heard of her. She's known for pushing the envelope. We need to understand her motivation beyond just a pathway." David and Elena began to dig deeper, beyond the HOA bylaws and property records. They looked into Priscilla's financial interests, her husband's business connections, and recent land acquisitions in the surrounding area. It was a slow, painstaking process, piecing together fragments of information from public records, local development proposals, and obscure corporate filings. The breakthrough came when Elena discovered a recently formed LLC, limited liability company, called Willow Creek Development Partners, that had been quietly acquiring adjacent plots of undeveloped land just beyond David's property line. The managing partner of this LLC was Priscilla Vance's husband, and several key investors were prominent members of the HOA board. This LLC had submitted a preliminary, unpublicized proposal to the County Planning Commission for a large-scale luxury apartment complex and a commercial strip mall, a project far larger than just a recreational path. David's 5 acres, nestled squarely between the existing development and the newly acquired parcels, were the critical missing piece. His land was the only viable access point from the established Willow Creek estates to this massive proposed development. The recreational path was merely a smokescreen, a legal pretext to acquire his land and unlock a multi-million-dollar profit for Priscilla, her husband, and their cronies on the HOA board. This wasn't about convenience for the community. It was about pure, unadulterated greed. The stakes were now astronomically high. David's refusal wasn't just a personal preference, it was blocking a massive corporate venture. This wasn't just about his property anymore, it was about protecting his home from a powerful, manipulative force willing to stop at nothing, even terrifying children, to get what they wanted. The battle lines were drawn, and David knew he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for the very soul of his family's legacy. Armed with the damning information about Willow Creek Development Partners and Priscilla's true motives, David and Elena crafted their counterattack. They knew they couldn't fight Priscilla Vance on her terms, in the shadows of HOA bylaws and petty fines. They had to expose her in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Their strategy involved several key elements. 1. Documenting the trespass. David installed discrete security cameras around the perimeter of his property, particularly focusing on the damaged fence and the disputed woodland area. He wanted irrefutable evidence of any further incursions by the HOA. 2. Building a legal case. Elena began meticulously compiling all the evidence, the non-existent easement, the escalating fines, the harassing communications, and critically, the financial ties between Priscilla, her husband, the HOA board, and the Willow Creek Development Partners LLC. They prepared a formal lawsuit not just for trespass, but for malicious harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, emphasizing the impact on David's daughters. 3. Rallying the community. David, with the help of loyal neighbors like Mr. Henderson and the Chengs, began quietly reaching out to other residents, sharing the information about the proposed development and Priscilla's personal financial interest. They created a simple, anonymous online forum for residents to share their own experiences with HOA harassment, which quickly filled with complaints. 4. Engaging local media. Elena contacted a local investigative journalist known for covering HOA disputes and development issues. She presented a compelling outline of the story, emphasizing the personal impact on David's family. The climax arrived at the annual Willow Creek Estates HOA community meeting, which Priscilla had optimistically planned as a rubber stamp approval for the recreational path and other community enhancements. The meeting was held in the packed community center, an air of nervous anticipation in the room. Priscilla, poised and immaculate in a sharp power suit, stood at the podium, flanked by her loyal board members, projecting an image of unflappable authority. She began with a cheerful recap of HOA achievements, then moved to the Recreational Path Initiative, outlining the significant benefits it would bring. She briefly mentioned unforeseen delays due to a single uncooperative property owner, casting a subtle, disdainful glance in David's direction. When it was time for community questions, Mr. Henderson, prompted by a signal from David, stood up. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "could you clarify the exact nature of the development this path is supposed to link to?" Priscilla's smile faltered slightly. "Why, it's for easier access to the new shopping district, Mr. Henderson. A convenience for all residents." "And does this convenience extend to the proposed multi-story apartment complex and commercial strip mall planned by Willow Creek Development Partners, LLC?" Mr. Henderson pressed, his gaze unwavering. A ripple went through the room. Priscilla's face tightened. "Mr. Henderson, those are entirely separate, preliminary proposals. They have no bearing on the immediate community path." At that moment, Elena Ramirez, David's lawyer, rose from her seat. "With all due respect, Ms. Vance, I believe they have every bearing. Especially since Willow Creek Development Partners, LLC, appears to be co-owned by your husband and several members of this very HOA board." A collective gasp swept through the room. Priscilla's carefully constructed composure began to crack. "This is outrageous. Unsubstantiated accusations. Mr. Miller, this is harassment," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at David. David, calm and resolute, stood up. "No, Ms. Vance. This is truth. My land, which you've repeatedly tried to buy, which you've trespassed on, which you've tried to claim an easement on, is the linchpin for your multi-million-dollar development. You didn't want a recreational path, you wanted a private access road for your personal profit." He then projected images onto the large screen behind the podium, the security camera footage. It showed the workers cutting his fence, Priscilla overseeing the trespass, and then, in a heartbreaking sequence, zoomed-in shots of Emily and Sarah, their faces contorted with fear and tears as they witnessed the invasion of their home. A stunned silence fell over the room. Many residents, who had only heard Priscilla's carefully spun narrative, looked horrified. Parents looked at their own children, then at the screen, a dawning realization of the extent of Priscilla's ruthlessness. "This is not about community benefit, Ms. Vance," David continued, his voice strong, emotion clear but controlled. "This is about terrifying two little girls to clear a path for your greed. You have no valid easement. My land is not for sale. And your actions, documented here, are not just an inconvenience. They are an illegal invasion of my property and a malicious campaign of harassment against my family." He finished by stating, "We have filed a lawsuit, Ms. Vance, not just for trespass, but for the emotional distress you have deliberately inflicted on my daughters. And I urge every resident here to look at their own HOA bylaws, to question every fine and improvement, and to consider whose interests this HOA truly serves." Priscilla Vance stood trembling, her face ashen. Her carefully coiffed hair seemed to droop, her designer suit suddenly looked too tight. The murmurs in the room escalated into a roar of outrage. Board members, seeing the tide turn, quickly distanced themselves from her. One by one, residents started shouting questions, demanding answers about the LLC, about their dues, about the fines they'd paid. The meeting descended into chaos. Priscilla, overwhelmed and exposed, stumbled back from the podium, her icy control finally shattered. She looked utterly defeated, her empire of perfect lawns and strict rules crumbling around her. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and severe for Priscilla Vance. The local news, alerted by Elena, picked up the story, featuring the damning footage of the trespass and David's tearful daughters. The community was appalled. Within days, Priscilla resigned from her position as HOA president, citing personal health reasons, though everyone knew the truth. Her husband's LLC faced intense scrutiny, and the large development project they had envisioned withered under the glare of public outrage and increased legal hurdles. The lawsuit David filed moved forward, though it was a long, drawn-out process. Eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence of harassment and trespass, Priscilla Vance and several key former board members settled out of court, paying a substantial sum in damages to David for the distress caused and the legal fees incurred. It wasn't about the money for David, it was about the acknowledgement of their wrongdoing and the validation of his stand. The HOA itself underwent a dramatic overhaul. A special election was called, and new, ethical leaders were elected. Mr. Henderson became the interim president, promising full transparency and fairness. The oppressive rules were reviewed and many were rescinded or significantly softened. The focus shifted from controlling residents to serving the community's genuine needs. The new board publicly apologized to David and other residents who had been unfairly targeted. David's property was finally secured. The pathway claim was formally dismissed. The damaged fence was repaired, and the scarred section of woods, though still bearing marks of the invasion, began to heal, slowly reclaiming its wild beauty. More importantly, Emily and Sarah began to heal. The nightmares slowly faded. With David's constant reassurance and the renewed sense of security around their home, they gradually ventured back into the woods, their laughter once again echoing through the trees. The trauma of that day lingered, a cautionary tale, but it no longer defined their lives. They knew their home was safe, protected by their father's unwavering love and courage. Life in Willow Creek Estates began to settle into a new rhythm. The divisions within the community slowly mended. Neighbors who had once been cold became genuinely friendly, many expressing admiration for David's courage. David, who had initially sought only peace and quiet, found himself a quiet hero in his community, a symbol of defiance against unchecked power. The old farmhouse, surrounded by its 5 acres of wild beauty, remained a testament to resilience. It stood not just as a home, but as a reminder that sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with grand armies, but with quiet resolve, unwavering principle, and the fierce love a father has for his daughters and the land they call home. The incident taught them that true community wasn't about perfectly manicured lawns or strict rules, but about mutual respect, fairness, and the strength to stand up for what is right, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. And David, watching his daughters play freely under the ancient oak, knew that this legacy, hard won, was worth every single fight.